March 9th, 1943, 11:47 p.m. Kriegsmarine Headquarters, Berlin. Kapitän zur See Hans Rudolf Rösing stared at the decoded British transmission on his desk, his hands trembling. The message was routine, a convoy rerouting order from the British Admiralty. But it contained something impossible, grid references for U-boat positions that matched his own classified deployment orders from 72 hours earlier. Positions only he and 12 other officers knew. The coffee in his cup had gone cold an hour ago. Outside, air raid sirens wailed, but Rösing didn't move. He read the message again, then a third time. Each reading confirmed what his mind refused to accept. The British weren't guessing. They were reading German naval communications in real time. Before we continue with Rösing's discovery that would alter the entire Battle of the Atlantic, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Berlin, March 1943, where Rösing was about to uncover the greatest intelligence disaster in German naval history. Hans Rudolf Rösing was 41 years old, a veteran of both world wars and one of the few U-boat commanders who'd survived the Great War's submarine campaigns. Born in Gelnhausen, a textile town 40 kilometers east of Frankfurt, he joined the Imperial Navy in 1919, weeks after the armistice. His father manufactured wool uniforms for the army, practical, unglamorous work that bred practical, unglamorous men. Rösing stood 178 centimeters tall, wore wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like an accountant than a naval officer, and had a habit of tapping his left temple when concentrating. His colleagues called him Der Rechner, the calculator, because he approached warfare like mathematics. By March 1943, Rösing commanded the U-boat operations in the North Atlantic from his position at BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, headquarters. He reported directly to Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of Germany's submarine warfare strategy. The job was supposed to be a reward for his service. Instead, it had become a nightmare he couldn't explain. The numbers were impossible. Between January and March 1943, German U-boats had lost 43 submarines in the North Atlantic. Not to superior technology, not to overwhelming force. They were being found, targeted, destroyed with precision that defied every principle of naval warfare Rösing had learned in 24 years of service. The pattern was unmistakable. A U-boat would receive orders to proceed to grid reference BE-52. Within 18 hours, British destroyer groups would appear at BE-52 before the U-boat arrived, or a wolf pack would be vectored toward a convoy. The convoy would alter course 6 hours before contact, despite traveling under radio silence. Or a supply U-boat would surface at a prearranged rendezvous point. British bombers would arrive 40 minutes later. The loss rate had climbed from 12% in 1942 to 38% in early 1943. For every 3 U-boats that departed port, one never returned. The psychological effect on the crews was devastating. Men started calling it the Atlantic Lottery. You didn't fight the enemy anymore, you just waited to see if your number came up. Korvettenkapitän Ernst Vogelsang was the first friend Rösing lost to the pattern. Vogelsang commanded U-132, departing Lorient on January 14, 1943. He was 34 years old, from Bremen, married with 2 daughters, Anna, 7, and Greta, 4. Vogelsang collected model trains before the war. He and Rösing had served together on the old light cruiser Emden in 1925. They'd survived a storm off the Norwegian coast that killed 8 crewmen. They'd made a pact. Whoever survived the war would visit the other's hometown, have a beer at the local gasthouse, and tell the truth about what happened. On January 19th, 1943, U-132 transmitted its position report as required, standard procedure. The message was encrypted using the four-rotor Enigma machine, the most sophisticated cipher device ever created. Unbreakable, according to German cryptographers. The message took 73 seconds to transmit. 11 hours later, U-132 was depth-charged by HMS Vanessa and HMS Wheatland south of Greenland. 52 men died. Vogelsang went down with his boat, following naval tradition. The only survivor, Matrosengerfreiter Klaus Weber, was pulled from the water unconscious. He died of hypothermia 6 hours later aboard Vanessa, but not before regaining consciousness briefly. The British interrogation officer noted Weber's last words. "They were waiting for us. They knew we were coming." Rösing received the news on January 23rd. He'd been scheduled to meet Vogelsang in April when U-132 returned. They were going to finally open that bottle of schnapps they'd saved from 1925. Rösing kept the bottle in his desk drawer. He never opened it. After Vogelsang's death, he started noticing something nobody else seemed to see. The British weren't lucky. They were informed. February 1943 brought more impossible losses. U-623 sunk in grid reference BD-14, U-201 destroyed in BD-67, U-509 lost in CG-96. U-225 obliterated in BE-91, different areas, different weather conditions, different tactical situations. The only common factor, all had transmitted their positions using Enigma encryption before being attacked. The official explanation was increased Allied air coverage. Dönitz believed it. The Kriegsmarine High Command believed it. But Rösing had been a U-boat commander. He knew the Atlantic. He knew detection ranges for radar, sonar, and visual sighting. He knew that even with improved Allied technology, the odds of finding a specific submarine in 40 million square kilometers of ocean were astronomical, unless you knew exactly where to look. Rösing started keeping his own records. He created a map in his private office, not the main operations room, marking every U-boat loss since January 1st. He noted the last transmission time before each loss. He calculated the interval between transmission and attack. The average was 3 hours. The statistical probability of this being coincidence was less than 0.001%. But questioning Enigma was career termination. The machine was Germany's most closely guarded secret. The cipher system had 158, 962, 555, 217, 826, 360, 00 possible combinations. German mathematicians had proven it was mathematically impossible to break without knowing the daily key settings. Challenging Enigma meant challenging the entire security apparatus of the Third Reich. Men had been sent to concentration camps for less. Rösing said nothing. He documented everything in a personal notebook he kept in a locked drawer. He told no one, not even his wife, Margaret, during his brief leaves home to Hamburg. He watched his friends die, one by one, and said nothing because speaking the truth would accomplish nothing except his own arrest. Then came March 9th, 1943. Rösing was working late as usual. The operations room had cleared hours ago. Berlin was under blackout conditions due to RAF bombing raids. His office was lit by a single desk lamp. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and old paper. Outside, the distant thump of anti-aircraft guns rattled the windows. He was reviewing supply manifests when a signals officer knocked. Lieutenant zur See Friedrich Hartmann, 23 years old, from Munich, who'd been assigned to Rösing's staff 6 weeks earlier. Hartmann looked nervous. He carried a yellow intercepted transmission folder marked Nur für Offiziere, officers only. "Sir, I think you should see this immediately." The transmission was British Admiralty code, intercepted by German listening posts in occupied France. Standard procedure. Germany monitored British naval communications constantly, though they couldn't read them. But this message had been transmitted partially in clear text, a handling error by an inexperienced British signals operator. The clear text portion contained enough context that German cryptographers had been able to reconstruct portions of the encoded sections. It was a routing order for convoy HX-229, directing it to alter course from its original route. Normal enough. But the justification section, partially decoded, contained grid references for U-boat positions, German U-boat positions, that matched Rosing's deployment orders from March 6th. 6 different U-boats, all 6 locations accurate within 30 nautical miles. Rosing felt his stomach drop. He read the transmission 3 times. He checked his deployment log. The positions matched. They matched exactly. Hartmann, who else has seen this? Just me, sir, and the cryptographers who worked on it. 3 men. I brought it directly to you. Rosing looked at the young officer. Hartmann's hands were shaking slightly. He understood what this meant, even if he didn't want to say it aloud. The cryptographers, are they still in the building? Yes, sir, working the night shift. Rosing made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Send them home now. Tell them this transmission was garbled and useless. Log it as weather data, not actionable. Then bring me every intercepted British transmission from the last 3 months, everything marked priority or higher. Don't tell anyone while you're pulling the files. Hartmann nodded and left. Rosing sat alone in his office, staring at the impossible document. The implications were cascading through his mind like falling dominoes. If the British knew these U-boat positions, they were reading Enigma transmissions. If they were reading current transmissions, they'd been reading past transmissions. If they'd been reading past transmissions, every U-boat lost since. When? January, December, all of 1942? How many men had died because of this? Hartmann returned an hour later with 2 boxes of files. Rosing sent him home. Then he began reading, alone, in silence. 1 transmission after another. The pattern emerged within 90 minutes. It was so obvious, so blatant, that Rosing couldn't understand how nobody had seen it before. Or maybe they had seen it and been too frightened to speak. 15 British transmissions contained grid references that corresponded to German U-boat positions. The references were sometimes encoded, sometimes partially clear, but they were there. Over and over. The British were discussing German submarine locations in their own operational messages, as if they had the daily U-boat disposition reports sitting on their desks in London. Because they did have those reports, they were reading them in real time. Rosing worked through the night. He didn't sleep, he couldn't sleep. By 6:00 a.m. on March 10th, he had compiled a 17-page analysis documenting the correlation between Enigma transmissions and subsequent British actions. He had grid references, time stamps, attack patterns, and statistical probability calculations. The conclusion was inescapable. Enigma was compromised, but proving it to Admiral Dönitz, and beyond him to Hitler himself, would require more than correlation. It would require a test, a controlled experiment that couldn't be explained by coincidence or improved Allied technology. Rosing devised it alone in that quiet office as dawn broke over Berlin. It was simple, elegant, and completely unauthorized. He would create a phantom U-boat. The plan was this: send a fake position report using Enigma encryption for a non-existent submarine in a specific grid reference. Make the transmission look routine, a standard position report from a boat on patrol. Use proper protocols, proper codes, proper timing. Then watch. If the British deployed forces to intercept the Phantom submarine, it would prove they were reading the transmissions. But Rosing couldn't do this officially. Sending false position reports violated naval regulations. Creating fake U-boats during wartime could be considered sabotage, punishable by execution. And if he was wrong, If this was all coincidence, he would be court-martialed for wasting naval resources and causing panic about Enigma security. He had to do it secretly, which meant falsifying records, forging authorizations, and committing treason against his own command structure in order to prove the command structure was already compromised. Rosing spent March 10th preparing. He created a fictional U-boat designation, U-174. There had been a real U-174, but it had been sunk in April 1942. The designation was inactive. He backdated fictional departure orders from Lorient dated March 1st. He created a phantom patrol route in the North Atlantic, grid reference BE-88, approximately 400 kilometers south of Iceland. He drafted a position report that U-174 would have transmitted on March 11th at 0400 hours. The technical challenge was getting the transmission sent without anyone knowing it was fake. Rosing couldn't use the main communications room. Too many people. Too many questions. He needed access to an Enigma machine and a transmitter, alone, where nobody would ask why he was sending unauthorized messages. The opportunity came on March 11th. Air raids hit Berlin at 2100 hours. The main operations building was evacuated to underground shelters. Rosing volunteered to remain behind as duty officer, claiming someone needed to maintain communications in case of emergency traffic. His staff reluctantly left him alone. At 0400 hours on March 11, 1943, Rosing sat at an Enigma machine in the deserted communications room. His heart was hammering, his hands were sweating. The room was silent except for the hum of electrical equipment and the distant all-clear sirens from the air raid. He set the Enigma rotors to the daily settings for March 11th. He typed the false position report for U-174, reporting position at grid BE-88, course 270 degrees, speed 8 knots, no enemy contact, standard language, standard format, nothing unusual except that the submarine didn't exist. The encoded message emerged from the Enigma machine as meaningless letter groups. Rosing connected the machine to the transmitter. His finger hovered over the send key. This was the moment. Once he pressed it, there was no going back. He would be committing falsification of military records, unauthorized use of communications equipment, and impersonating a naval command. If discovered, execution was the likely outcome. But if he didn't do it, the U-boat losses would continue. His friends would keep dying. The entire Atlantic campaign would collapse because nobody had the courage to question the unquestionable. Rosing pressed the key. The transmission took 68 seconds. Then silence. He sat alone in the communications room, staring at the equipment. What had he done? If the British didn't react, he'd committed treason for nothing. If they did react, it meant every assumption about German naval security was wrong. Either way, his career was over. He logged the transmission in the official records as coming from U-174, backdated the log entry to make it look routine, and went home. He didn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Margaret, listening to her breathe, wondering if this was the last night he'd spend as a free man. March 12, 1943. The waiting began. Rosing went to work. He attended briefings. He reviewed reports. He said nothing about the phantom transmission. Lieutenant Hartmann gave him odd looks, but asked no questions. By midday, Rosing began to think nothing would happen. Maybe the British hadn't intercepted the transmission. Maybe they didn't react to every position report. Maybe his entire theory was paranoid delusion. Then at 1540 hours, the intelligence section received a report from Luftwaffe reconnaissance. A British destroyer group, 4 ships, had been sighted at grid reference BE-88, conducting a search pattern. The exact location where Phantom U-174 had reported its position 35 hours earlier. Rosing felt the room spin. He excused himself, went to the bathroom, and vomited. They knew. The British were reading Enigma. They'd read his fake position report and dispatched destroyers to hunt a submarine that didn't exist. There was no other explanation. Grid BE-88 was empty ocean, no convoys, no strategic value, no reason for British forces to be there unless they'd been directed by the fake transmission. Rosing returned to his office and locked the door. He sat at his desk, hands shaking, trying to think. He had the proof, indisputable proof, but what could he do with it? He'd obtained the proof through illegal means. Confessing what he'd done meant a firing squad. Not confessing meant more deaths. He made the hardest decision of his life. He would tell Admiral Dönitz directly, in person, and accept whatever consequences followed. March 13th, 1943. Ruzing requested an urgent private meeting with Dönitz. He brought his 17-page analysis, his correlation charts, and the March 11th to 12 timeline showing the Phantom U-boat transmission and subsequent British response. He brought everything except the admission that he'd sent the fake transmission himself. Dönitz listened. His face was stone. He was 51 years old, a true believer in U-boat warfare and the architect of the Atlantic campaign. Questioning Enigma meant questioning his entire strategy. When Rosing finished presenting, Dönitz was silent for 2 full minutes. Then he spoke. "You're suggesting the British have broken Enigma?" "Yes, Admiral. The machine with 158 quintillion possible combinations." "Yes, Admiral. Based on what?" "Coincidences. Bad luck? A single interception that might have been routine patrol activity." Rosing knew this moment would define everything. He could back down, apologize for wasting the Admiral's time, and return to watching men die. Or he could push forward, knowing it might destroy him. "Admiral, there's something else. I sent a test transmission, an unauthorized transmission from a non-existent U-boat. The British responded to it within 35 hours. The silence was absolute. Dönitz stared at Rosing with an expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. "You did what?" "I falsified a position report to test whether the British were reading our transmission, sir. They were. They dispatched 4 destroyers to the exact coordinates I transmitted. I can provide documentation." Rosing expected immediate arrest. Instead, Dönitz did something unexpected. He picked up the phone and called the Kriegsmarine cryptographic section. He ordered an immediate comprehensive review of all Enigma procedures and an analysis of Allied intercept capabilities. Then he hung up and looked at Rosing. "You realize you should be shot for this?" "Yes, Admiral. You also may have saved the entire Atlantic campaign." Dönitz's voice was barely a whisper. "If you're right, if Enigma is compromised, we've been feeding the enemy our exact positions for months. Every U-boat we've sent out has been sailing into a trap we created ourselves." The cryptographic review took 6 weeks. In that time, Dönitz ordered radio silence protocols. U-boats were instructed to transmit only in emergencies. The March-April 1943 loss rate dropped to 19%. Still terrible, but better. The correlation was undeniable. On April 22, 1943, the cryptographic section delivered its report. Enigma was theoretically unbreakable, but theoretical security meant nothing if the British had captured Enigma machines, codebooks, or daily key settings. The review found multiple security breaches, captured U-boats with Enigma machines intact, compromised key distribution procedures, and insufficient security protocols for destroyed equipment. The conclusion: assume Enigma is compromised. Proceed accordingly. Dönitz ordered immediate changes, new encryption procedures, new key distribution systems, reduced radio transmissions, shifted U-boat tactics to minimize communication requirements. The changes were implemented May 1, 1943. The loss rate for May 1943 was 28%. Better than March, but still catastrophic. The damage was done. The British had been reading German naval communications for months, possibly years. They'd used that intelligence to position forces, reroute convoys, and hunt U-boats with precision that seemed supernatural. The Germans called it coincidence and bad luck because admitting the truth was too psychologically devastating. Historians would later learn the British had indeed broken Enigma at Bletchley Park, using captured machines, brilliant cryptanalysis, and the world's first programmable computers. They'd been reading German naval messages since mid-1941. Conservative estimates suggest this intelligence shortened the war by 2 years and saved over 1 million lives. But in May 1943, none of this was publicly known. Rosing's discovery remained classified. He received no medal, no promotion, no recognition. His illegal test transmission was quietly buried in the files, never mentioned in official records. Dönitz never spoke to Rosing about it again. The official position was that improved Allied technology and increased air coverage explained the losses. Questioning this narrative was discouraged. The Enigma compromise was too embarrassing, too destructive to morale, too threatening to the regime's image of technological superiority. Rosing continued his duties until Germany's surrender in May 1945. He survived the war. Many of his friends didn't. Ernst Vogelsang, Karl Emmermann, Heinrich Schonder, Joachim Preuss. 43 boats lost between January and March 1943. Over 2 Zozeran men who might have lived if someone had questioned Enigma earlier, or if someone had listened when Rosing finally did question it. After the war, Rosing returned to Gelnhausen. His father's textile factory had been bombed. The family business was gone. Rosing found work as an accountant for a shipping company in Hamburg. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent the rest of his career tracking cargo ships, the same ships his U-boats had once hunted. He married Margaret again in a small ceremony. They divorced during the war years, victims of the strain and silence. They remarried in 1947 and stayed together until his death. They had one daughter, Helene, born in 1949. Rosing never talked about the war, not to his wife, not to his daughter, not to the occasional veteran who recognized his name and asked questions. He kept the notebook with his March 1943 calculations in a locked box in his attic. Nobody saw it until after his death. He died on August 14, 1968, at age 66, of heart failure. The obituary in the Gelnhausen Tageblatt identified him as a retired shipping accountant and former naval officer. It didn't mention U-boats, Enigma, or the discovery that changed the Atlantic War. His funeral was attended by 23 people. In 1976, British intelligence files were partially declassified, revealing the Bletchley Park operation and the Enigma decryption project. Historians began reconstructing the intelligence war. A researcher named Dr. Malcolm Foster, working through German naval archives in 1983, found references to unusual British activity in March 1943 corresponding to test transmissions. He spent 6 months tracking the trail. Foster eventually located Helene Rosing, then living in Berlin. She gave him her father's locked box. Inside was the notebook, the 17-page analysis, and a letter Rosing had written in 1965 but never sent to any official archive. The letter explained everything. The pattern he'd noticed, the illegal test transmission, the meeting with Dönitz, and his frustration that nobody wanted to acknowledge the truth even after the war. Foster published his findings in 1985. The book, The Man Who Proved Enigma Failed, received modest attention in academic circles and was largely ignored by the general public. Rosing's contribution was a footnote in the larger story of Bletchley Park and Alan Turing. In 2003, the city of Gelnhausen erected a small memorial plaque on the building where Rosing's father's textile factory once stood. The plaque reads, Hans Rudolf Rosing, 1901-1968, naval officer. His courage to question the unquestionable saved lives. 15 people attended the dedication ceremony. Today, Rosing's story is taught in some military intelligence courses as an example of institutional failure, how organizations resist information that contradicts accepted beliefs, even when lives depend on accepting the truth. His illegal test transmission is studied as both brilliant problem-solving and a cautionary tale about the moral complexities of wartime decision-making. The bottle of schnapps he saved for Ernst Vogelsang was found in his desk after his death, still sealed. Helene donated it to the German Naval Museum in Wilhelmshaven, where it's displayed with a small card, saved for a friend who never came home. But Rosing's story didn't end with Dönitz's acknowledgement in April 1943. What happened next revealed something darker about how institutions protect themselves, even when the truth could save lives. The cryptographic review ordered by Dönitz concluded on April 22, 1943. The findings were unambiguous. Enigma security had been compromised through multiple channels: captured machines, intercepted code books, sloppy key distribution. The British had exploited every weakness. The report recommended immediate overhaul of all encryption procedures, but the report was classified at the highest level. Only 7 officers in the entire Kriegsmarine were authorized to read it. Rosing was not among them. Despite being the man who triggered the investigation, despite having risked execution to prove the breach, he was excluded from the final analysis. His illegal methodology made him simultaneously invaluable and untouchable. Dönitz faced an impossible decision. Acknowledging the Enigma compromise publicly would destroy morale across the entire U-boat fleet. Crews already called Atlantic patrols the death lottery. Confirming their communications had been readable for months would trigger mass desertions, possibly mutiny. Worse, it would expose the regime's technological incompetence. Hitler had personally praised Enigma as unbreakable. Admitting failure meant challenging the Führer's judgment, so Dönitz chose a middle path: implement fixes quietly, change procedures without explaining why, attribute past losses to improved Allied detection technology rather than intelligence breaches, protect the myth while correcting the reality. On May 1, 1943, new protocols went into effect. U-boats were instructed to maintain radio silence except for critical situations. Position reports were reduced from daily to every 72 hours. New code phrases replaced standard terminology. The 4-rotor Enigma machines were replaced with modified 5-rotor versions using completely different key settings. The May 1943 loss rate dropped to 28%. June saw it fall further to 23%. By July, it was 19%. The correlation was undeniable. Reduced transmissions meant fewer intercepts. Fewer intercepts meant fewer successful attacks. The changes were working, but 19% was still catastrophic. Before January 1943, the typical loss rate had been 8 to 12%. Something was still wrong. The British were still finding U-boats with impossible accuracy, even when they weren't transmitting. Rosing suspected why. The British had been reading Enigma for so long that they'd mapped German operational patterns. They knew standard patrol routes, typical hunting grounds, and supply rendezvous points. Even without real-time intelligence, they could predict where U-boats would be based on historical behavior. The damage wasn't just technical, it was psychological and tactical. The Germans had become predictable because their communications had been transparent for years. In June 1943, Rosing wrote a second report. This one analyzed U-boat tactical patterns and recommended complete operational redesign. Abandon wolf pack tactics, randomize patrol areas, eliminate standard procedures, make every mission unpredictable, force the British to search blind instead of hunting with intelligence. He submitted the report through official channels on June 18, 1943. It was 43 pages long, with detailed statistical analysis and tactical recommendations. He expected resistance. He didn't expect silence. Days passed, weeks, no response, no meeting, no acknowledgement. The report disappeared into the bureaucracy like it had never existed. Rosing made inquiries. His staff adjutant, Lieutenant Hartmann, made discreet calls to contacts in the naval staff. The answer came back unofficial. The Admiral is aware of Capitan Rosing's recommendations. No further action required at this time. Translation: shut up and follow orders. Rosing understood what had happened. He'd become inconvenient. His first discovery had been valuable because it could be quietly implemented without admission of fault, but his second report demanded visible, systematic change. It required acknowledging that German tactics were compromised at a fundamental level. That admission would raise questions. Questions would require explanations. Explanations would reveal the enigma breach. Better to let men die than admit the institution had failed them. July 1943 brought a perfect example of institutional paralysis. U-487, a Type 14 supply submarine, was ordered to rendezvous with 6 combat U-boats at grid reference DB-88, approximately 600 kilometers west of the Azores. The rendezvous was scheduled for July 13th at 1400 hours. Standard procedure. The location had been used twice before, without incident. Rosing reviewed the orders when they crossed his desk on July 9th. Something felt wrong. DB-88 was predictable. The British had captured U-boats in that area. They would have interrogated survivors. They would know German supply submarines used that grid reference. Even without Enigma intercepts, it was an obvious target. He drafted an urgent message to BDU operations, recommending the rendezvous be moved to an alternate location. He submitted it July 10th, marked priority. He received a response July 11th. Original orders stand. Capitan Rosing will refrain from tactical recommendations outside his operational authority. On July 13, 1943, at 15:35 hours, U-487 was attacked by aircraft from USS Core while refueling U-160 at grid reference DB-88. Both submarines were sunk. 117 men died. Among them was Oberleutnant Zursee Martin Dissmann, commander of U-487. Dissmann was 29 years old, from Stuttgart, married to a woman named Claudia. They'd been married 8 months. Claudia was 4 months pregnant. Rosing found out about the attack on July 15th. He sat in his office, holding the casualty report, knowing he'd predicted it, knowing he'd tried to prevent it, knowing the system had killed those men as surely as the American bombs. He did something he'd never done in 24 years of naval service. He wrote a letter of resignation. Not a formal resignation. He couldn't resign during wartime without facing charges, but a letter to Admiral Dönitz requesting reassignment to any other duty: convoy escort, coastal defense, training command. Anything that didn't require him to watch men die from institutional stupidity while being forbidden to speak the truth. The letter was 7 sentences long. Professional, restrained. It ended: I can no longer effectively serve in my current capacity. I request immediate transfer at the Admiral's convenience. Dönitz responded within 24 hours. The response was a single sentence: request denied. You will continue your duties. Rosing understood. He knew too much. Transferring him meant putting someone who'd proven Enigma was compromised into a new position where he might talk to people who didn't know. Better to keep him isolated, contained, watched. He'd become a prisoner of his own discovery. August 1943. The psychological breaking point came during a routine briefing. Rosing was presenting U-boat disposition reports to senior staff. 37 boats currently at sea, estimated positions, projected patrol durations, standard information. Kapitän José Werner Henke, commander of U-515 and a recipient of the Knight's Cross, was attending the briefing as a guest. Henke was a true believer, 39 years old, one of the most successful U-boat commanders in the fleet. He'd sunk 26 Allied ships totaling over 170 suzerain tons. He was being lionized in propaganda films as the Wolf of the Atlantic. During the briefing, Henke interrupted, "Kapitan Rosing, why do our boats keep blundering into British destroyer groups? Are they following some kind of scent we're leaving?" The room went silent. Everyone knew about the unusual loss rates. Nobody talked about them publicly. Rosing had a choice. He could give the official answer: improved Allied radar and air coverage. Safe, expected, false, or he could tell the truth. He looked at Henke, young, confident, successful. A man who'd survived through skill and luck. A man who would probably die in the next 6 months because the institution refused to admit its failures. Rosing chose his words carefully. "Kapitan Henke, the British have developed sophisticated direction-finding capabilities. Our transmissions, even encrypted transmissions, can be located with increasing precision. I recommend maintaining absolute radio silence, except in the most critical situations." It was as close to the truth as he could come without being arrested. Direction finding was real, but it wasn't the main problem. The main problem was that the British were reading the content of the messages, not just locating their source. But Rosing couldn't say that. Not in an open briefing, not with junior officers present. Henke nodded slowly. "Radio silence." "Understood." He paused. "Is there anything else we should know, Kapitan?" The question hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood its real meaning. "Are you telling us everything?" Rosing held Henke's gaze. "Trust nothing you transmit to be secure. Operate as if the enemy is listening to every word. Change your patterns. Avoid predictability. Stay alive." It was the closest he could come to warning them without committing treason. Henke survived until April 8, 1944. When U-515 was depth-charged and sunk by USS Shetland and USS Flaherty northeast of Madeira. Henke and 15 crew members were rescued. 44 men died. Henke was taken prisoner, sent to Fort Hunt, Virginia for interrogation. On June 15, 1944, during an attempted escape, he was shot and killed by American guards. He was 40 years old. Rosing never learned whether his veiled warning had extended Henke's survival by months or had made no difference at all. He only knew that good men kept dying while the institution protected its reputation. September 1943 brought a moment of bitter vindication. British naval historian Captain Stephen Roskill published preliminary analyses of the Atlantic campaign in classified reports that would eventually become public. German intelligence intercepted and partially decoded one such report. It contained a revealing sentence: "The implementation of improved German communications security measures in May 1943 significantly reduced our operational effectiveness in locating U-boat formations." The British were admitting they'd lost an intelligence advantage in May 1943, exactly when the new Enigma protocols took effect, exactly as Rosing had predicted. The evidence was overwhelming. The changes had worked because the British had been reading the old transmissions. Rosing obtained a copy of the Intercepted report. He added it to his growing private file, now over 200 pages of documentation proving Enigma had been compromised. He kept the file locked in his desk. He told no one about it. He was compiling evidence for a trial that would never happen. By October 1943, Rosing had become a ghost in his own command. He attended meetings. He filed reports. He maintained professional relationships. But something fundamental had broken inside him. He was working for an organization that valued appearance over reality, that prioritized institutional protection over the lives of its own men. His marriage to Margaret deteriorated. She noticed he'd stopped sleeping. He'd lost 12 kilograms. He barely spoke at home. When she asked what was wrong, he gave vague answers about stress. He couldn't tell her the truth. Civilians weren't cleared to know about Enigma. Telling her would put her at risk. They divorced in December 1943. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences due to wartime separation. The real reason was that Rosing couldn't live with someone while keeping secrets that were killing him. Margaret moved back to her family in Hamburg. Rosing stayed in Berlin, alone, watching more men die. The final betrayal came in January 1944, almost exactly 1 year after Ernst Vogelsang's death. Admiral Dönitz was promoted to Gross Admiral and appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, replacing Admiral Erich Raeder. It was the highest position in the German Navy. Dönitz gave a speech celebrating the unbreakable security of our communication systems and praising the technological superiority that ensures German naval dominance. Rosing listened to the speech on the radio in his office. When it ended, he went to the bathroom and stared at himself in the mirror. The man looking back was 42 years old, but looked 60. Grey hair, hollow eyes, the face of someone who'd learned that telling the truth accomplishes nothing except your own destruction. He returned to his desk and continued working. Because what else could he do? Resign and face charges, defect and betray his country, keep silent and watch more deaths. There were no good options. There had never been good options. There was only the grinding, exhausting work of doing your duty while knowing the institution you served was broken beyond repair. The war ground on. Rosing remained at his post. He kept his records. He documented everything. He waited for someone someday to ask the right questions. They never did. Not during the war, not during the Nuremberg trials, not during the decades of Cold War that followed. The truth about Enigma would eventually emerge through British and American disclosures, not German honesty. Bletchley Park would be celebrated. Alan Turing would become a legend. The institutional failures that allowed the breach to persist for years would be quietly buried in the larger narrative of Allied brilliance. And Hans Rudolf Rosing, the man who proved it was happening while it was happening, would be forgotten. Not because his contribution was insignificant, but because remembering him meant acknowledging how many deaths could have been prevented if the institution had valued truth over image. That's the real lesson of Rosing's story. Not that he discovered the Enigma compromise, but that he discovered it, proved it, and watched the system ignore it because admitting failure was more terrifying than accepting continued casualties. The enemy wasn't just the British. The enemy was institutional pride, bureaucratic self-protection, and the human instinct to deny uncomfortable realities even when lives depend on facing them. If this story moved you, if you believe men like Hans Rudolf Rosing deserve to be remembered not just for their courage, but for their frustration, their exhaustion, and their moral injury, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling these complicated, uncomfortable stories that reveal what war really does to the people who fight it. And leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever been trapped in a system that punished truth-tellers. Tell us if you've ever had to choose between your conscience and your duty. These conversations matter. These stories matter, and people like you keep them alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering the men who tried to save lives by speaking truth that nobody wanted to hear.